Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Transform My Space with Mav Construction. Today we talk about foundations. We're gonna compare strip foot foundations to your raft foundations, also known as mat foundations. Please make sure that you consult with a qualified geotechnical person as well as a qualified engineer for your project to sign off on your foundations. If you love our type of content, do hit subscribe, share the video, and do comment. Keen to hear your thoughts. Enjoy. Let's talk about foundations, particularly shallow foundations, which are mostly found in the context of home building. In the case of a shallow foundation, the foundation doesn't seep deep below the ground level, and hence the term shallow. Now, there are two types of foundations that are commonly used in this context. You get your raft foundation, which is also called the mat kind of foundation, and you also get your strip footing, also known as the wall footing. Now, the foundation plays a key role in terms of structural integrity. The foundation is responsible for transmitting the loads of the house evenly and effectively onto the ground. A good foundation will do two things and do them very well. One being that a foundation has got to keep the structure intact. And what that means is that the structure shouldn't separate or crack at any point around it. The other thing is that the structure has got to remain upright. The structure may remain intact, but if it starts to tilt on one side or the other, and then that foundation is then failing. Let's talk about a strip footing foundation. Now, what is a strip footing? A strip footing is formed when reinforced steel is actually covered with concrete to form a base or leg onto which a little wall is built to form that strip foot foundation. Now, when building strip foot foundations, trenches are dug, particularly where the walls are going to be running, those walls that are going to be load bearing, transmitting the forces of the house, the forces of the roof onto the ground. And so the path or the trenches are then dug exactly where those walls are going to be. Then there is reinforcement steel tied and actually placed in those trenches and then covered with concrete. On top of that concrete, you then start building foundation walls, typically using clay bricks, because clay bricks do not actually retain water compared to other bricks. That's why they are typically used in foundations. And so that is how you build a strip foot foundation. You need concrete, you need reinforcement steel, you need to dig your trenches, and you're going to need some bricks to lay that foundation up. Then to top it up a bit, to build your floor slab, you would have to compact the soil in between those trenches and those foundation walls. And then you would have to then put on top of that compacted soil a damp-proof membrane to make sure that the water from the foundation does not seep into your structure. On top of that, laying your reinforcement mesh wire, typically made of steel, and then pour concrete on top of it. That is a strip foot foundation. Now let's talk a little bit about raft foundation, or what is also known as a mat foundation. Put simply, a raft foundation is when the foundation trenches, the foundation floor slab pretty much covers the entire area under the roof. And so the point with this raft is that, similar to a raft that you find in the ocean, in the river, is that that structure is able to remain intact despite what is happening with the soil beneath it. To build a raft foundation, you would have to dig some blocks, pretty much like squares put together. That's where your trenches are then going to be dug out. You then have to put up some shuttering to control the concrete and to keep it into shape in the form of a box typically. You then fill those trenches with reinforcement steel, which is very tight, very well, and the mesh wire then connecting on top of it. Key thing before I forget is to have the damp-proof membrane on top of the compacted soil of that raft, so that you don't again have water seeping into your structure from your foundation. And so that is how you then build, the base of your raft foundation. Once the shuttering is in place on the side, you've got your damp-proof membrane in place to keep the water below. You then have reinforcement steel within those boxes. You lastly simply pour concrete on top of it. And then you've got this boat-like structure which is going to remain intact despite any movements that are happening. That is pretty much what a raft foundation is. Slightly more expensive than a strip footing, but it's got its advantages. Now, we cannot talk about foundations without talking about soil types. First, let's talk about clay. Clay tends to feel very sticky into your hands. It absorbs a lot of water, which means clay is able to remain wet for a very, very long time. Clay is very malleable, which means you are able to form different shapes. We actually grew up playing around with clay. You can make stars or whatever shapes that you wish to make with clay, and it's able to maintain the shape that you make. And so those are some of the properties of clay, and that's how you know you're dealing with clay. When clay dries up, it actually contracts and you'll see these cracks on it. And when it is wet, it also expands and actually exert forces onto the foundation. If you have clay on your site, you have to consider raft foundation, because a raft foundation will keep the structure intact. And even though certain parts of the house get exposed to moist clay, while others get exposed to dry clay, you have this differential forces on the foundation, and the foundation actually remains intact. So if you have clay, make sure you go for raft foundation. Next, let's talk about silt. It is quite fine. Somewhere between clay and sand, you find silt, and those fine particles actually mean that silt is able to actually hold water quite a bit, which is not good for foundations. But the other thing about silt is that silt can be highly compressible, which means that should you compress it or try and compact it, it bounces back pretty much to its initial shape, its initial position. And so that makes it very, very difficult for foundations, because it means that you have movements which are undesirable for building foundations. And so if you have silt, you have to then again consider using a raft foundation, so that the chances of that house moving on top of silt, are far, far less. But then the other thing that I must mention is that some people will completely clear the site that contains silt and replace the silt sand with your more stable sandy soil, to actually eliminate or not have to deal with silt. But that's the gist of it, is that if you are dealing with silt, you have to put in a raft foundation. The next soil type we're going to talk about is Dolomite. Now, Dolomite is actually present in South Africa in some regions, and if you check on Google, you will see certain regions in South Africa that are more prone to having Dolomite. Dolomite appears very, very hard. Even from inspection, looking at it, it looks like a solid hard surface. But the problem with Dolomite is that it tends to dissolve or disintegrate when it is exposed to water. In other words, Dolomite can pretty much melt, and form these ugly sinkholes beneath the structure. And also it can form certain cavities beneath the structure. And so because of that reason, then if you have a Dolomite site, you want to have a raft foundation that will actually keep your structure intact and upright despite what is happening below with the Dolomite rock beneath the foundation. And so the point I'm making is that if you have Dolomite on your site, you have to consider the raft foundation. Now let's talk about sand. Sand is very common. It is typically found on a lot of the sites that you're building on, and it is also what you typically find in your gardens. Sand is actually the best soil to build on. Sand will not hold much water, but most importantly, sand is compactable, which means you are able to compact it, and it is able to then maintain that position after compacting, which is really good for foundations. So if you've got sand on your site, you are able to easily use a strip foot foundation, or what you call a wall footing foundation, and not require the draft, because of the sand is considered stable soil. and it was not going to give your foundation problems. So if you've got sand, you are able to use a strip foot foundation. Next, let's talk about gravel. Gravel actually feels like loose sand. You get these small little stones from it, and it also contains some sand particles. So it is like very coarse, sandy kind of feeling. And because of that reason, it does not retain much water. So water drains easily away from gravel. That's one thing. The other thing is that it can remain pretty stable, which means it doesn't react to weather conditions such as, it is too hot or too cold, or perhaps it is raining and therefore the gravel starts to react. It doesn't. It remains fairly stable. And so if you don't have gravel on your site, you are able to use strip foot foundation without any issues, because gravel is stable, it does not move, it is good soil to build on, and so strip foot foundation is sufficient. The next type of sand we're going to talk about is rocky sand. Now, rock can be a challenge to build on because it is hard. In some instances, you may have to blast it, but again, we're talking shallow foundations, and so you are able to then, try and remove bits of the rock using your TLB, for instance, to try and dig your trenches of that. But the point about rock is that it does not retain water at all. And most importantly, rock never reacts to weather condition. It simply remains stable. If you have rock on your site, provided you are able to easily form your trenches, because that's what the challenge is. Rocky sites do not require complex foundations. They simply require the strip footing. So if your site has got rock, simply put in the strip footing, you should be fine. Now let's compare the two types of foundations in summary. If you've got Raft foundation on one end, strip footing on one end, the first key, criteria to look at is a cost. Raft foundation is significantly more expensive than strip footings. The next thing to look at is longevity, reliability, and structural integrity. If you compare Raft foundation to strip footings, Raft foundation is a safer option to go to. It can be expensive, but whenever you are in doubt, chances are you have to go the Rafts. The next thing to look at or to consider is that Raft foundations tend to be a lot more complex and more laborious to put into place. You require some deckings, a bit of shuttering to actually box in the concrete first, and so it might also require some skills to put into place. While as with strip foot foundations, all you need to do is dig in your trenches, lay out your steel for reinforcement and simply pour concrete onto it. And so if I was to compare Raft foundation to strip footings in terms of complexity and skilled labor to build, Raft foundation is more complex. So there you have it, peeps. Before buying the land, try and get a sense of what foundation is going to be required, because foundation can make a big difference in terms of the expenses. To do this correctly, appoint a geotechnical person who's going to pull a sample of that soil to classify it so that the engineer can then prescribe a suitable foundation. If you love our type of content, please do subscribe, hit like, share the video, and comments. Keen to hear your thoughts. Once again, Math Construction signing out. Take care.